Welcome back to Things You Don't Know. I'm Dr. Weaver.
And I'm Dr. Sean Deneen.
And I am Chandler Foster.
Today we're talking about an issue that's convolute and has a lot of different legs to it. We're going to talk about U.S. expansionism, specifically how it accelerates after the War of 1812. And we're going to keep the focus where it just too often isn't. It's almost ignored. And that is the impact and the effect on Native Americans.
I just have to say here, Dr. Weaver, you are right. It is very too often ignored. And this isn't just a side story here.
No, for many Native nations, the War of 1812 and its aftermath marked a turning point that reshapes the map, the law, and daily life, often catastrophically.
And we're starting with the War of 1812, not because it's the first moment of American expansion, far from it, ladies and gentlemen, but because it's a hinge.
The war ends, U.S. nationalism rises, and the balance of power in the interior changes.
For Native nations in the Great Lakes, the Ohio Valley, and the Southeast, the post-war years bring a combination of treaty pressures, military coercion, settlement surges, and new federal policies that aim at land acquisition as a permanent feature.
We're going to move chronologically here, but we'll pause for a few deeper case study moments.
We'll also avoid melodrama, corny jokes, all that sort of feel good kind of fuzzy wuzzies, because this material that we're covering is pretty serious. Let's look at why the War of 1812 mattered for Native Americans before it even started. When most people learn something about the War of 1812, what did they learn? They learned there was a conflict between US and Britain, and about impressment and maritime rights and national honor. All that is very real, but it's also very, very incomplete.
We just did a podcast on that, folks. I encourage you to check it out. But the war's causes are entangled with land.
Yes, they are. And in the decades after independence, the U.S. pushes steadily west across the Appalachians into the Ohio Valley and into the Great Lakes.
Native nations resist. Some negotiate, some fight. Many do both, depending on their circumstances.
But the big strategic reality is this: the British Empire in Canada remains a nearby power that can arm, supply, and diplomatically support native resistance.
That doesn't make native nations British puppets at all. It makes them allies and serious players in a geopolitical contest.
And on the US side, a faction often called the War Hawks, figures like Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, they're pushing for war with Britain.
They talk about Canada, but the frontier is central to their thinking.
The basic argument is that Britain is removed as a partner for native resistance. The U.S. frontier becomes easier to dominate.
And that connects directly to the native political movement led by Tecumseh and his brother Tinkasatekwa, often called the Prophet.
Tecumseh tries to build a multi-nation confederacy across many nations. The Shawnee, the Delaware, the Miami, the Potawatomi, the Kickapoo, and many others to resist land cessions.
The Confederacy's basic argument is this: no single tribe has the right to sell land that affects all. Land is held collectively.
This argument that Chandler just mentioned, it runs straight into the U.S. treaty system, where American officials often aim to secure secessions from selected leaders, sometimes under heavy pressure, sometimes amid internal divisions, and then to treat it as final and applicable across the board.
That collision produces violence, most famously around Tippecanoe in 1811 before the war officially begins.
And Tecumseh is away recruiting.
General and future President William Henry Harrison attacks Prophetstown. That becomes a prelude, convinces many on the frontier that war is inevitable, and it convinces many Native community that the United States intends conquest.
So, when the war begins in 1812, Native nations are not an afterthought. They're very much central actors.
Absolutely. In the Great Lakes and along the borderlands, Native military power matters.
The U.S. suffers early disasters like Detroit, partly because Native and British forces coordinate effectively.
Tecumseh's presence is a major factor. Native allies, sort of like the Viet Cong almost 200 years later, know the terrain, can mobilize quickly, and can disrupt supply lines.
But it's important to be precise. Native participation isn't uniform. If it had been, I think the outcome would have been very different.
I think you're quite right, Dr. Weaver. Different nations make different choices based on local politics, survival calculations, old internecine rivalries, trade or political relationships with the UK and the US, and what they think the war's outcome will mean.
That's exactly right, Dr. Deneen. Some communities allied with Britain because Britain appears to offer a better chance of limiting U.S. settlement.
Some try to stay neutral, some ally with the US, hoping that their cooperation will protect their land or at least secure them some leverage.
But there's a broader theme. Many Native leaders see this war as an opportunity, maybe the last viable one, to force the U.S. to recognize a boundary to expansion.
And then comes 1813. Tecumseh is killed at the Battle of the Thames.
That's the turning point, the hinge inside the hinge.
Yet Tecumseh's death is not just a battlefield event, it's a political catastrophe for the Confederacy and their efforts.
It fractures coordination, weakens morale, and removes the most capable diplomatic organizer, political leader, and military commander of the movement.
From there, the U.S. position in the Old Northwest improves.
And when the war ends, the settlement question comes roaring back. Now, not only the U.S. has more confidence, Native Americans have far fewer external options. So let's talk about the peace settlement, something that probably a lot of people don't even know anything about. And that's the Treaty of Ghent in 1814. And by the way, folks, this doesn't have anything to do with Belgium, which didn't even exist at this time.
No, it was still Belgium was still considered part of Holland.
Yep.
This is one of those quiet moments that carries enormous long-term consequences.
During negotiations, the British initially proposed the idea of an Indian buffer territory, a boundary zone in the interior that would limit U.S. expansion and protect allied native nations.
Hey, that doesn't happen though.
It collapses right away. Britain ultimately prioritizes ending the war over enforcing that protection.
The final treaty largely restored pre war boundaries between Britain and the U.S. and does not secure a lasting, enforceable native buffer state.
Now, there are provisions about restoring rights and possessions for Native allies, but without a power willing to enforce them, those words don't restrain U.S. settlement pressure.
So, from a native perspective, the war ends with a brutal result. Many communities fought believing they were defending their homelands, and the peace settlement doesn't lock in protections that match their sacrifice.
I want to make this very clear. It's not just symbolic.
No, you're right, Dr. Deneen, it's not. And once the British stopped reliably supplying arms and political support in the same way, native nations in the Great Lakes and Ohio valleys faced the U.S. with reduced leverage.
The U.S. can now negotiate from strength, backed up by settlers and state governments hungry for land.
People sometimes talk about the post-war from around 1815 post-war years as an era of good feelings. But that phrase isn't describing the frontier or what the Native American experience was.
No, after 1815, several forces converge.
Absolutely. Nationalism and confidence. Americans framed the war as a second independence, and that fuels a belief that the Republic is destined to grow. Wow. Population pressure. More settlers want land, farms, towns, speculation, opportunities, infrastructure and state building, roads, forts, and later canals increased migration and market access. A tightening federal state partnership in acquiring land through treaties when needed, military action.
And for Native nations, expansionism is not an abstract concept.
No, it's not. It's settlers showing up, fencing fields, cutting timber, hunting gain into scarcity, and demanding that local governments and militias handle the Indian question.
That becomes code for compel land cessions, remove native presence, or enforce containment.
I want to underline something. US leaders don't always describe this as conquest. In fact, very rarely do they say that.
No, they describe it as something else: legal purchase, civilization policy, or orderly development.
But the outcomes, loss of land, sovereignty, and in many cases, the loss of lives, folks. These things are real. It's happening.
Yeah. Let's focus on the Great Lakes and Ohio Valley first, since that's where the War of 1812's native dimension is most highly visible.
After the war, a pattern intensifies: treaties to chip away at native territory in what becomes Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio.
The U.S. uses a combination of diplomacy and coercion, sometimes offering annuities and sometimes leveraging starvation or debt, sometimes exploiting divisions within nations, sometimes simply tolerating illegal settlement until it forces a new negotiation.
And once settlers are on the ground, they have their fences, their houses, all that other stuff. Guess what? They become a political pressure.
Territories want statehood, states want jurisdiction, and native land becomes the obstacle in the eyes of many American officials.
And that is key.
The logic of U.S. expansion after 1812 increasingly treats native sovereignty as temporary at best.
Even when treaties, quote, recognize tribes, the practical expectation is that those lands will eventually be ceded.
So, for Native communities in this region, the post war years are about survival under accelerating encroachment.
Many adapt economically. Some engage in more marketable hunting or trade. Some adopt farming more intensely, create constitutions even. But adaptation doesn't guarantee security because the core objective of largely white settler communities is still acquisition of the land itself.
Now, in the Southeast, people often treat the War of 1812 and Indian removal. Don't you just love that phrase, Indian removal, as separate chapters? They're connected.
They certainly are. During the War of 1812, the Creek civil conflict, often known as the Creek War, becomes intertwined with U.S. military campaigns.
Andrew Jackson's role matters here. It plays a huge part.
After the U.S. victory, the Treaty of Fort Jackson in 1814 forces massive land cessions. Importantly, including land from Creek factions that had allied with the U.S. as well as those who had fought against it.
Which sends a pretty clear message. Alliance does not guarantee protection.
Exactly, and that foreshadows later removal.
The post war cotton economy booms, and slave labor expands, and planters hunger for land in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Florida.
Native nations, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, stand in the way of a slave plantation empire.
This is where the moral language of civilization gets weaponized.
Some native nations, as we said, adopt farming, written constitutions, schools, and other institutions. Some even become slaveholders themselves, partially to demonstrate sovereignty and partially to engage the United States on its own terms.
And yet, even when native nations pursue these strategies, they face the U.S. political movement, especially strong in the South, that argues that Indians must be removed regardless.
The idea becomes any native presence inside state boundaries is intolerable to state sovereignty.
I mean, I am gobsmacked with that notion. It is the key, though. Expansionism becomes not only about land, but it's about jurisdiction. It's about culture. It's about eradicating culture. And who has legal authority? Let's move on. Let's talk about law because people hear treaty and they assume fairness.
In U.S. constitutional theory, treaties are the supreme law of the land.
But in practice, enforcement depends on political will.
By the 1820s and 1830s, three Supreme Court cases, often called the Marshall Trilogy, defined tribes as, hang on to your hats, folks, domestic dependent nations. That phrase matters.
Yeah, why does it matter? Because it recognizes some form of nationhood, supposedly, while also totally limiting it.
Right. The decisions describe tribes as having a kind of sovereignty, but not the full sovereignty equal to foreign states.
That structure gives the federal government enormous power.
It is a legal framework that can be used to protect tribes if the political branches choose to, but it can also be used to rationalize domination.
And at the same time, states, especially Georgia, push hard to extend state law over native lands. This is despite all the treaty promises.
Which sets the stage for removal.
When the federal government chooses removal as a national policy, legal opposition doesn't stop it.
No, it doesn't. It becomes part of a system where native nations are acknowledged as political entities largely so they can sign treaties ceding land or be forced into agreements under duress. So we have to address the Indian Removal Act of 1830 Got to say, that title just really irks me, by the way. It's later than the War of 1812, but it grows out of the post war acceleration.
Removal, sadly, isn't an isolated event, it's the end point of a trajectory.
By the 1820s, many U.S. leaders openly argued that coexistence is impossible, that assimilation is failing, or that state sovereignty must prevail.
So, Chandler, when you're saying assimilation is failing, what you're really saying is that Native Americans were very reluctant to give up their culture, their beliefs. And so they were considered to not be part of the great state that they were in or the great white notions that they were operating under.
Exactly, because they didn't want to give up what meant so much to them.
Removal becomes framed as humanitarian in rhetoric, moving Native people away from settlers to avoid violence.
But in practice, what it does is serves land acquisition.
And the impact, ladies and gentlemen, is devastating. Death from disease and exposure, loss of homes, dis- disruption of political and social institutions, and long-term trauma.
And here again, folks, alliance doesn't save you. Civilization policies don't reliably save you. Court victories don't reliably save you either.
No, they don't. The engine underneath is demand for land and political control. And the War of 1812 removes one of the major external checks, which was British leverage, from much of the interior. You know, it's easy to say the US expanded, but I want to name what that meant for actual communities.
On the ground, expansion often meant
Encroachment, settlers moving in before treaties were even finalized or honored, resource collapse, game depletion, timber cutting, and farmland taken out of native use, violence and intimidation, not always official army action, often militia raids or vigilante aggression.
Which were never penalized.
Absolutely not. You're exactly right. Treaty pressure, negotiations in which native leaders faced hunger and death threats, or divided councils. Cultural disruption, mission schools, bans on practices, and policies aimed at remaking native societies to fit American expectations.
And there's a psychological effect that's hard to quantify, but it is nonetheless real. The sense that the future is being decided elsewhere by distant capitals, treaty commissioners, or state legislatures, and enforced locally.
which is why Native resistance doesn't vanish.
No, it still stays very much in place. It just comes in a different form.
Sometimes it's armed conflict, sometimes it's strategic diplomacy, sometimes it's building new political institutions, sometimes, regrettably, it is moving and rebuilding again and again under impossible conditions.
So, if we had to summarize the War of 1812's relationship to expansionism, what's the core?
For Native nations in the interior, the war's end is a green light moment for U.S. settlement.
Not because every American leader is thinking in those terms constantly, but because the strategic environment shifts.
Britain has other concerns. It's no longer positioned in the same way as a protector of Native resistance. The United States is more unified, more confident, and more willing to treat native land as the primary reservoir for growth.
In other words, we can get more money, we can have more stuff if we just take their land from them. and move them somewhere else. Put them on what? A reservation? And the war's popular memory, which is we stood up to Britain, can obscure the reality that one of the war's most lasting consequences is paid for by native nations.
Yes, the aftermath is not just border stability.
No, it's not. It's an expansion surge that intensifies treaty dispossession and culminates in removal policies.
And if there's another takeaway today, it's that U.S. expansionism after 1815 isn't a vague national story.
It's a set of policies and pressures that restructures native life in the Great Lakes, in the Ohio Valley, and the Southeast through law, treaty, settlement, and force. Why don't we just call it like it is? It's not restructuring, it's destroying, it's robbing of life.
Well, precisely, Chandler. And the other thing is that we don't want to short shrift this because, as you'll find out in our upcoming podcast from the Powhatan nations, they suffered too. They suffered too. All Native Americans suffered with this.
Oh, yeah.
So when we talk about American growth, it's historically responsible to say what that growth cost and who paid the price.
Okay, we could go on and I could get really wound up because this is a very important and sensitive topic for me. But we're going to stop this episode of Things You Don't Know for today.
And I have to say, Dr. Weaver, it's a topic that it's near and dear to my heart, and I can get very passionate and riled up about it sometime.
Mine as well.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. And it might even be good in the future to do a deeper dive into one region, maybe old Northwest treaty cycles, the Southeast jurisdiction battles, or even the way infrastructure projects like roads and canals indirectly accelerated dispossession.
I'd like to see a focused episode on Tecumseh's Confederacy as a political project, not just a wartime alliance.
Great idea. Great idea. All righty. Well, come on back and see us. And that's all for today. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye bye.